that he's made that's brought us to the floor today.
Gentleman's recognized, 7 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, there are a number of people who deserve special thanks and accolades today, but I want to point out 3 of them who are in our midst. First, I want to commend the efforts of Representative John Lewis, now a member of Congress, who shed his blood on Bloody Sunday so that the original 1965 Voting Rights Act would be passed. I want to pay special recognition to my good friend and ranking member, John Conyers, who in 1965 was here. In 1970, when the first renewal, 75, 82, and 92, he was here. And we suspect 25 years from now, he'll be here for the next renewal of the Voting Rights Act, if in fact it is required. I want to pay an extra special thanks to the chairman of our committee, Representative James Sensenbrenner, who I believe will go down in history as a warrior who supported, defended, extended, and made real our democracy in this country, and he deserves our supreme thanks. I rise today in unwavering support of H.R. 9. The bill is the product of a long-term, thoughtful, and thorough bipartisan deliberation that carefully weighed the competing concerns and considerations that have engulfed debate on the Voting Rights Act since its inception. The Act has been extended on 4 occasions, making it arguably the most carefully reviewed civil rights measure in our nation's history. H.R. 9 continues that practice of careful review accompanied by extensive record evidence in support of its provisions. I am proud to have been a part of the bipartisan coalition that crafted this legislation and believe that it strengthens the very foundation of our democracy. H.R. 9 restores the Voting Rights Act to its original intent to secure and protect the rights of minority citizens to participate equally in voting. The bill bars voting changes that have the purpose of discriminating against minority citizens, and it restores the ability of minority communities to elect candidates who share their values and represent their interests as originally intended by Congress. Now, there are those who argue that the Voting Rights Act has outlived its usefulness, that it is outdated, and that it unfairly punishes covered jurisdictions for past sins. Yet I stand here today as living proof of both the effectiveness of and the continuing need for the Voting Rights Act. I stand here on the shoulders and in the aftermath and in the history of George H. White, who rose on the floor of Congress in 1901, January 29, as the last African American in the Congress of the United States after Reconstruction, when he said, "Mr. Chairman, this perhaps is the Negro's temporary farewell to American Congress. But let me say, Phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again." And he was right, but it took a long time. You need to understand that that was not delivered in a vacuum. Listen to what happened leading up to that election. In Halifax, the registered Republican vote was 345, and the total registered vote of the township was 539. But when the count was announced, it stood 990 Democrats to 41 Republicans, 492 more Democratic votes counted than were registered in that city. There was discrimination taking place, and I'm the witness to it. The Voting Rights Act had been in effect just shy of 30 years in 1992, when I and former colleague Eva Clayton became the first African Americans elected to Congress from the state of North Carolina since George H. White delivered that speech in 1901. Put plainly, nearly 3 decades elapsed after the passage of the Voting Rights Act before the impact of the Voting Rights Act became real in North Carolina. We should be clear. Although the successes of the Voting Rights Act have been substantial, they have not been fast and they have not been furious. Rather, the successes have been gradual and of very recent origin. Now is not the time to jettison the expiring provisions that have been instrumental to the success we applaud today. In a nation such as ours, we should want and encourage more Americans to vote, not fewer. The Voting Rights Act and the renewal and restoration contained in H.R. 9 facilitate those very goals. By breaking down entrenched barriers to voter equity, this bill invites, inspires, and protects racial and language minority citizens' full and equal participation in the governance of our nation. We must not fear that participation. We must embrace and celebrate it instead. Upon the introduction of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson noted that the Voting Rights Act is like no other piece of civil rights legislation because, quote, every American citizen must have an equal right to vote, close quote. About this, he said, there can and should be no argument. Make no mistake, voting is democracy's most fundamental right. Undermining the right to vote is a fundamental wrong, one that must be eliminated. I ask for 30 additional seconds.
Granted.
Mr. Chairman, a Congress with far fewer African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because the right to vote had been denied far too long. Congress made a moral decision that it was the right thing to do for our democracy. It's time for us to reaffirm that decision by passing H.R. 9 without amendment today in this House. I ask my colleagues to stand up and make a moral statement that democracy lives in the United States of America.
The gentleman from Wisconsin.